Let's go around and take speaking orders. Opening government.
Speaking first, Maria Schaefer, please. Stephanie speaking second, Schaefer as well.
Opening opposition.
For the first Clement, Eamin. Second is Karthik.
Closing government.
First will be Eamin, second from Soren.
And closing opposition.
Speaking first, Rahul, please.
Second, Ollie shooter.
Fantastic. Audience, please be quiet so that we can hear the speakers and that the speakers can hear the time signals. To open the debate, we're very happy to call upon the Prime Minister here.
Is this a good volume for everyone? Awesome. I'll do very quick pleasantries. Thank you to my lovely partner. Thank you to the HCDU. Thank you to all of the judges. Thank you to all of the volunteers. Thank you to the Penn Debate Society. Thank you to UPenn for letting us be in this building, and everybody else that I did not manage to thank. Thank you for all the debaters as well. Also, Belle, follow my belly, please. It's Maria C. at. I'm very invested in this. As any Canadian worth their salt could tell you, the dissolution of NAFTA and the subsequent debacle that was USMCA was one of the most humiliating experiences of being a country that is not America. I want you to keep this in mind as we go through this debate. The counterfactual that opposition must support is the certain economic devastation that we knew happened after the dissolution of NAFTA. The certainty that they must defend, that is the fact that we put years and years and years of investment as Mexico and years of investment into these economic plans that positioned us to be the hub of manufacturing that all had to go to shit and blow up in our faces the moment that NAFTA dissolved. They have to defend this huge waste of money. They have to defend the fact that they spent so much money trying to develop land for US factories to be able to come in, and none of that was ever going to come to fruition. At the very least, we will have some amount of certainty or likelihood that we can get some amount of economic benefit on our side of the house. I'll give you a pretty basic reason as to why we think economically Mexico will be better off. Then I'll give an argument about why Trump would have never gotten into power. And then lastly, I'll give you an argument about borders and drug violence. The first thing that I want to do is just give some basic arguments about why economically I think we would have been better. The first thing that I want to make very clear is that Mexico can produce far more cheaply than the US and at a larger scale than Central and South America. So without free trade, I think it is important to note after their period of industrial gains that the liberalization is still able to be good. And notably that they were able to have a lot of other countries in their midst. This is important because if opposition wants to run any material about possible US protectionism in the future, that is after 1994 onwards, therefore, we understand that they are in a better position on our side of the house. And they could take advantage of, for example, the golden age of Argentina or various other different countries, and they could strike different bilateral trade deals as well, along with the US, for example. That just means that they're positioned with better optionality and less likely to have these situations. The second thing is that in 1994, it is important to note Mexico was very poor. And at this point in time, there was a lot of low-skilled agrarian workers. Importantly, what we are able to do with the industrialization means upskilling that labor. Why is that important? I think it is far better to be able to spend money into upskilling labor to trying to get into, for example, the tertiary and quaternary sectors, because that was a big problem when NAFTA came around. That is the fact that they still had to import a lot of the workers for the higher managerial parts of their economy from America, and then the rest of manufacturing still had to be within Mexico. Even if you don't believe that we were able to get to, obviously, the best place that America or Canada was able to get to, I think you believe that we can place money into things that will get us out of having to be in these agrarian societies. The second thing is I do think that we are able to take advantage, thank you, of Mexico's resource-based advantages, the various agricultural products that we were able to create in Mexico. That means that we are able to position ourselves just broadly better in the global economy. All of this just means thus. Obviously, it is very bad what happened with NAFTA with regards to us investing a lot of money into something that genuinely failed. So long as we can prove any alternative that won't genuinely fail, like opposition, thank you, must defend, I think that is reasonable. And obviously, you can look at the list of examples of other countries across the world who have all used these different kinds of ways in order to make their economy better. Nigeria, for example, which are all reasons why we don't have to get ourselves stuck in this terrible trade deal. The next part, thank you, of our material is that we just do not think that Trump would have gotten into power. I want you to think a little bit about the reasons that Trump really got into power, and then especially with regards to the second election, why he got into power. It is because of the manufacturing industry, and it is because of the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. These are reasons that are unlikely to have come to fruition if it was the fact that Mexico wasn't able to position itself using the NAFTA trade deal as a place where so much cheap labor was able to be created as an alternative. That is to say, it was through NAFTA that Ford set up so many factories in Monterrey in Mexico that meant that all of their labor was suddenly exported to Mexico. Obviously, this might have been in the biggest tipping point. I want you to think about scale, and I want you to think about compounding. If you start, no thank you, with NAFTA from 1994 all the way up to now, where Mexico has now positioned itself within North America as this manufacturing hub, where North America and Canada is able to have so many things that are manufactured in Mexico at cheap prices, and then to be able to buy them, it means that you automatically need to mean that all of these manufacturing jobs in America are going to be hollowed out at least a far faster rate than it otherwise would have occurred. I think this is really important. No, thank you. If you think about the last election, the main reasons why Trump won were not generally because of politics, but were generally because of economics, or generally because of fears of globalization that necessarily meant that people felt like their jobs were being taken away. That oftentimes NAFTA was actually pointed as the prime example of reasons why we are having this kind of liberalization that is taking away all of our jobs in the moment. I'll take a POI from closing quickly.
To clarify, your thought process is, oh, all the factories we built during NAFTA just like magically poofed into dust when NAFTA failed? Like, why?
Like, obviously they did not all magically poof into dust, but can you imagine the billions of dollars that Mexico spent in the last 20 years and how much money that was wasted because obviously they can't do all the things that they used to be able to do with NAFTA. Now they have to pay all of these frictional costs. Now they had all these projects and plans that meant, oh, we thought that America would allow us to have all of this labor, and we thought America would allow us to sell all of these products, and now we can't sell all of these products to America and Canada that we thought we otherwise would be able to sell. Obviously, this is very shit for economic planning on Mexico's part. The last part of the OJ case is we just think, broadly speaking, this is far better for the US-Mexico border. Why? The open border policy of NAFTA, I think, is a large component why you had the less policing or the de-policing of the border that led to a lot of the problems that, number one, got Trump elected, and number two, a lot of the problems that continue to persist as things that Mexico has to deal with now. Why? It is just necessarily true structurally that when you have an open border, it means that you cannot police it as much. In order for you to have any level of economic efficacy, it is just true that you need to be able to have people move transport, move agricultural products, move commodities at a fast rate and not be stuck at the border for long periods of time, because that is the only merit of being able to have a free trade deal like this. But this means that you cannot focus on the policing of the border in ways that really matters. Specifically, it just must be true that if you have an open border, more drugs must be crossing that border. And that's really bad, because what is the biggest problem in Mexico right now? It is cartels. The biggest problem is that you have the terrorization of civilians. The biggest problem is that you have people who are being kidnapped, who are being mutilated, who are being killed, and that is all being funded by drug money that is able to be funneled through that border. This was the reason, by the way, why Trump wanted to build the wall, because he believed that this border is a problem, and obviously Mexico is going to put far more policing into that border, and knowing it is a problem once it doesn't have to weigh up the economic benefits of having an open border per the stipulations of NAFTA versus actually the protection of their civilians and making sure that they can curb or at the very least halt the drug trade. Incredibly proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister very much and are happy to call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Here, here.
All right, I guess I'll do pleasantries first. Thank you so much, Karthik. Thank you so much to everybody at PDS. Me and him and Rohan and Vincent were competing, so we didn't help out with the organizing. But the Penn volunteers like worked day and night to like clean up the GA, for example, like keep the board vacuum then after everybody was here. So I want to give a huge thank you to all of them as well. I also want to thank everybody who came here as judges, all the teams, everybody who debated and just generally had a really, really good time with. Like we hit these guys very, very often. It's always fun. And last thing I want to say is that like Soren and Eamin and me and Karthik last year were in the USUDC finals as well, but we were in the novice final. You know, second year, but now in the Cornell final. All right. Seven Maria makes two mistakes in this debate. Firstly, Mexico, coming out of the 1990s, was coming out of a left-wing one-party state that was incredibly inefficient and had massive state-owned enterprises that didn't do much in these economies. The burden they needed to fulfill was not just to prove that NAFTA was bad, but why exactly this industrial transition is going to work well. There are two reasons why this is unlikely to happen. One, when you have this industrialization, the already corrupt state on their side of the house gets to pick and choose who are the winners, i.e. they put the cronies in power. They choose which state enterprises to subsidize. They choose which industries are the ones that get the quota protections on their side of the house that entrenches the inefficient industries on their side of the house, but also empower the political power holders that held Mexico back. We'll extend on this later. But secondly, they just stick to inefficient programs, as in these companies don't produce the best goods or whatnot. And the problem with this is that the rest of the world is liberalizing at this time. They're adopting free trade. The problem when Mexico doesn't engage in these law of the jungle of competition that was early 2000s is that when you finally do open your borders, the rest of Southeast Asia, for example, is so much better at producing whatever you want to produce that you have no ability to compete in the long run. During this time, Mexico also couldn't export to other countries because the tariffs that the United States put onto it, for instance, on its agriculture sector, was so large you didn't benefit from this in power, and Mexico was much more closed and insecure as an economy. The second thing is the idea about Trump they see on their side of the house. Maria says, Trump is going to come and reverse NAFTA, so NAFTA is pointless. Several problems with this. One, you had 20 years of massive prosperity, which billions upon billions upon billions of dollars flowed into Mexico. But secondly, like the CEO said, the factories don't go poof. You had massive amounts of money, not only to upskill your workers during this time, but importantly, after the factories are built, now the rest of the world got a lot richer. So now the factories in Mexico that produce cars, they don't sell it to the United States, but they export it all around the world because they have 20 years to perfect being the best car makers in the entire world. But secondly, the problem on their side of the house about NAFTA costing Trump is several things. One, the United States was in a particular uni-party moment in which both the Democrats and the Republicans believed in the efficacy of one trade policy, as in they wanted free trade. The problem with this is that if they hadn't gone in Mexico to sign the free trade deal, they would have the massive political incentive and economic incentive to reshore to somewhere else. So instead, they use the political pressure that they have. They don't get as good of a deal. They get a deal with India or Indonesia or Vietnam. They get a deal with other Latin American countries that likewise have a large, cheap workforce that's able to be developed and able to get things going there. Perhaps they go into Argentina, for example. All these things means is that you have, importantly, Trump still happens on their side of the house, but somebody else gets the economic benefits. Two arguments then. Firstly, how has NAFTA hugely benefited Mexico economically? Free trade saw the huge transfer of wealth from the United States into Mexico. Why did this happen? This happened because Mexico, like many other developing countries at the time, had a large workforce, had cheap labor, had proximity to the United States. And investment happened massively when you drop these trade barriers, because now you can get no tariff. You can have no longer subsidies, so foreign businesses coming in can compete against the businesses in these countries, and you no longer have import quotas or IP laws and commercial laws that make you scared to invest in this country. So this happened to one main thing. Massive amounts of FDI entered this country. You had the auto industry develop that employed hundreds of thousands of Mexicans in northern Mexico. For instance, you got the middle class job that paid much higher than the manufacturing job you had previously. Importantly, the immigration program that they talked about also helped, because massive amounts of seasonal workers came into the United States, made a huge amount of money, and then came back or sent the money back to their families in these instances. This leads to massive amount of wealth development in the long run. Because importantly, when you employ lots of people, it has run-on effects in the Mexican economy. Because the people who get the job in the foreign industries, even if they are middle-class workers, they spend it in the service sector inside of Mexico, which gets jobs to other people for those other people to upskill into managerial roles. But beyond this doesn't happen on their side of the house when the U.S. signs a free trade deal with somebody else who has the same place of Mexico and get all this investment that will occur anyways. Even though on their side of the house, it was ultimately canceled, and even though you announced that you're going to liberalize at some point, that isn't enough for the investment to flow in, because the investment uniquely needed to happen at that particular moment. These large auto companies or these large Apple companies or manufacturers in the United States had too little supply and too much demand in that moment, which is why they would have moved. And once they move away, this movement and investment is sticky, because you already built factories in Vietnam, you already built factories in Indonesia, and like those free trade agreements will presumably still last on their side of the house. But secondly, you get massive political concessions from the United States, i.e., they give Mexico a lot of things in order for Mexico to sign a NAFTA trade agreement. We think this looks like a lot of benefits and pressure that they got from international creditors, i.e., international creditors gave Mexico a better credit rating, better economic laws, and better interest rates because there was a perception that it's no longer a left-wing government with a non-market economy. They trusted that they had common laws, that they had common commercial laws similar to the United States, and didn't have unfair competitive measures like free subsidies and like quotas and like tariffs. And because of this, the loans that the Mexican government were able to get were a lot cheaper. They were bailed out by the IMF in the 1990s. This would have been a lot worse on their side of the house. We think the deficit spending that the Mexican government had the ability to do, to spend on welfare, to expand on infrastructure, to spend on education, was the reason why Mexico is now relatively prosperous compared to how they were back in the 1990s. But thirdly, the US dropping tariffs onto Mexico, the imports into Mexico being cheaper, capital goods like computer technology and like farm equipment that uniquely was only built in the United States and Mexico can't build themselves, but also consumer goods like medicines, like food, like the people who got cell phones and all these things for a lot cheaper, massively improve the quality of life of Mexicans on the ground. Before I move on, closing.
Argentina doesn't have a border with the United States. They'll still need to trade with Mexico.
Yeah, but the problem is the cost of the tariff is like 20-30%, right? But then the cost of like shipping is presumably still cheaper. So this is why like trade restrictions is more important than geography because transportation is very, very cheap. Okay, political liberalization in Mexico. Mexico was a very corrupt state. It was a one-party state and it was transitioning to democracies in the 1990s. What does this happen? Three things happened. One, this broke political power holders that were mainly controlled and made lots and lots of money from these state-owned enterprises and had massive ability to influence the government. When the foreign businesses come in, these people have less money to lobby, to bribe the cartels to do a bunch of things for them. And also, secondly, you allow the free enterprise in the middle class to form because instead of being tied to the job in which they had to pay dues to the party members or have network connections to get a job, anybody could get employed in the Ford factory that was set up in Mexico, which built a middle class that wasn't tied to the existing political structure that existed. This allowed the democratic transition in Mexico to occur far faster. And importantly, the way here of why this matters is that this is the reason why democracy and free enterprise happen. When you don't have things like inefficient governments and corruption holding back, like this is the Nobel Prize like thing, right? It's because like the Econ Nobel Prize thing, right? It's because corruption effectively actively like delays your economic growth because it's incredibly inefficient and it doesn't encourage businesses to innovate. For these reasons alone.
Thank you for the opposition very much, and I have to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
I'll give quick pleasantries as well. The last finals we made, I forgot to do this and I regretted it for a long time. So thank you to Maria for partnering with me and for making debate a very enjoyable experience. Thank you for the entire Harvard College Debating Union for sending us a tournament. Thank you for UPenn for running a great tournament and Clement for letting us live in his room and use his resources. That was cool. You should also follow me on Belle. I'm Eamin. Clement wants to be a CIA spy so he can tell you a lot about Mexico. What I'm gonna do is tell you a lot about debate. Every reason that Clement gives you for why it was the case that Mexico was leaving a state of like a one-party extremist state, a very leftist country, a country that had a lot of nationalized companies, are reasons that still exist on our side of the house. That transition doesn't stop simply because Mexico does not join NAFTA. So I think even on our side of the house, we are able to get these same benefits of companies being privatized. We are able to get these same benefits of a U.S. under Bill Clinton that was open to globalization, that was open to more trade. I think a simple comparative and a simple difference in this debate is whether that opening up happens immediately, i.e. all of the Mexican markets are immediately open up and like free market traded such that U.S. investors and U.S. companies can come in and do whatever the fuck they want, or whether this is something that happens more gradually and on Mexico's terms. That's to say, you are able to privatize the companies as Clement describes there was impulse and urge to do, and you are able to build these homegrown Mexican companies and homegrown Mexican skills before the US comes in and imports their own FDI and imports their own managerial, like upper echelons, whatever, and before they fuck over Mexico. The first thing Clement says is that this industrial transition will be bad because Mexico was exiting a one-state regime. Again, this is just symmetric, unclear why this doesn't happen on our side. But secondly, Bill Clinton and his era of globalization also still happens. Why is this likely the case? A, because the belief of US economists during this time was just that this was good. But B, because they wanted to find something that was geographically proximate, right? Because like of the very simple and stupid reason that you want to trade goods, trading goods like from a geographically further distance exponentially increases that cost. And Clement's response to this is just like, but these tariffs will mean that they're still expensive. These are US tariffs that the US can get rid of, right? So if the US wants to trade more with Mexico and be able to import more products from Mexico, then they can get rid of the US tariff on Mexican agriculture. This happens anyways on our side of the house. So unclear what Clement is saying here. Why is it the case that geographical trade and geographical proximity is cheaper? I think this is very simple. When you have to trade further distances, you have to start employing things like air trade or start employing things like trade by shipping. There's a lot of upfront shipping costs for you to do things like open ports and open up like shipping routes from Argentina, for example, or from Vietnam, which is like really, really fucking far from the United States, right? So Mexico is just a lot cheaper. I think what all of this suggests is that a lot of the US FDI and investment interest in Mexico exists anyways, but simply this interest into Mexico is directed better on Mexican terms. Yeah. Why is it much better for Mexico to pursue internal industrial policy and do this on their own terms? I think there are a few reasons why this is true. The first is that you're able to like just much better equalize between regions, right? The issue is now if you go to Mexico today, there are vast swaths and provinces in Mexico that still look industrially a lot like what Mexico looked like in the 1990s, this like nightmare scenario that Clement wants to describe, right? Where there was a lot of agrarian reliance, where there was a lot of issues because the Mexican economy historically was built up under this like leftist regime that was not very good at economics. The issue is the US has no incentive to build up multiple regions of Mexico. The US, when they come into Mexico, concentrate all their factories in Monterrey, where there are already industrial policies that built up roads specifically because Monterrey is really close to the US and it's easy to ship there. They concentrate capital in the same area so that they can achieve scale. But what happens on our side is when you have industrial policy set at a state level designed to internally benefit and develop Mexico first, you are better able to balance and organize between all of these interests. But secondly, it's also just you get homegrown Mexican companies. And I think this is very important because we're having this debate with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that inevitably NAFTA will fail, that the US will pull out, and that you will no longer be able to be this hub feeding things to the US. But Odd's response is to say, but these factories presumably still exist and they don't just go poop simply because you transition away from NAFTA. A few issues, right? The first is that these factories don't disappear, but they also weren't built for internal industrialization. These factories are producing goods that are needed by US consumers specifically, rather than something that now under a tariff environment and a tariff regime can also be like demanded by Mexican consumers or could be pivoted towards like the new global order or whatever. The factories or places whose ownership is American companies. And the issue is when the US decides they don't want you anymore, the car plant that you built because Ford wanted a car plant doesn't just automatically turn into a food processing plant that is still useful for you. The issue is if your car plant made Ford cars, there is no equivalent Mexican company that can now buy up this car plant and keep it efficient and keep it useful, right? So the issue then is on our side of the house, we just have far more Mexican homegrown companies, which means that A, when terrorists inevitably come, when the US inevitably becomes isolationist, these factories are still usable, they are still producing, and they are still employing people. But B, it also just means you get more employment of Mexicans to begin with because the US, when they move into Mexico, are likely to bring their own workers and upskill their own workers rather than Mexican ones opening.
The specific type of region-based development on your side is bad because it is regional interests that causes them to do industrial policy in inefficient areas rather than the most economically productive areas on our side that make money, and then you can tax it to fund government programs to transfer wealth.
Clear to me why maximal economic efficiency is in the Mexican people's interest, right? When A, we have told you one capital goes back to US companies properties and flows back into the US. And B, I think like you just fuck over a lot of Mexicans who don't happen to be in the regions that are considered important for the US, aka the ones that are close to the US and easy to transport there. I think a more balanced system of internal industrial development is much better for Mexicans, given that even if on net you have less economic efficiency as a whole, more Mexicans are able to be benefited by that economic efficiency. I think it is good if specific regions get developed as like agricultural hubs, whatever, it means that farmers are able to get better jobs. Why does industrial policy followed by gradual liberalization work? I think the first thing is there are just auxiliary benefits to industrial policy that are good. There are significant investments in infrastructure, which generates jobs. There's significant investment in education, which means that future generations are able to access higher skilled labor. They're able to move into the service industry, etc. But secondly, you also just expand the pool of private capital within Mexico more, right? That's to say, if you have like the rise of oligarchs because they own homegrown Mexican companies, in the future you're able to just get more private capital for more innovation, etc. You just get more development within Mexico. Lastly, I think the Trump point is still just very, very important because the fact of the matter is a big reason why Trump won was because NAFTA existed, was because he was able to tell people in the Rust Belt, you lost your jobs because they all went to Mexico. Elections in the US are decided on very, very small scales. I think the fact that it is more likely that we don't have Trump fucking over the world on our side, they say, give me a ballot with us. I'm very proud of themselves.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much and are happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Can everybody hear me from here? Okay, so there's some quick pleasantries. Just want to thank Clement for being an amazing partner. I want to thank everybody else in the panel, and also want to thank the Penn teams and the Penn organizers who've made this tournament possible, and also, of course, the judges who are like taking time out this weekend to judge. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2. It's not enough for opening government in this debate to say that they want liberalization to happen, but just not tell us how it's going to happen or why it's going to happen in meaningful and positive ways. Their side has decided in this round to be incredibly uncomparative, and I think that is why OG is out of the debate. In this speech, I'm going to talk about 2 things. Firstly, I want to talk about economics. Secondly, I want to talk about politics. Firstly, on economics, the first thing that we get from their side is that Mexico is cheaper, guys. Like Mexico has geographical proximity. Of course, the US is going to continue to trade with Mexico. The problem here is that during 1994 and that like period of time, the US was experiencing a major shift away from manufacturing into the services industry. What that meant was that they needed to offshore. The question was where? If not Mexico, they were going to go to another country, right? And what that means is that if they go to another country, the chances that the US will ever come back to Mexico are very, very slim. That means that Mexico at that period of time had to sign on to NAFTA so that it could have that comparative advantage before any other country did so. There are plenty of other Latin American countries that are nearby the US, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina. They're not that far away. So it's not enough for Steph to say, oh, like, of course, it's not going to go to Vietnam and China. There are many other Latin American countries that would have seized the opportunity that Mexico had then. If Mexico refuses, they go to other countries. We think Mexico should have chosen that opportunity, right? No, thank you. We think that because of this, Mexico has that benefit and can uniquely lock itself in. The second thing that they say in Steph's speech is that Mexico has many poor areas, right? The problem here is that like on their side, you don't have any investment going into Mexico from like US MNCs at all. So these poor areas exist on their side, and the government has to use its own budget to like somehow like milk the economy that like is non-existent and dead in Mexico. What do we say happens on our side of the house? When you have manufacturing plants opening in Mexico, one, that gives like tax revenue, right? Like these companies are here, you're able to collect taxes. But second, export revenue, right? You are exporting to other countries and making money that there's jobs that these people are working. What that means is one, not only do you have like larger government budgets because you're not like necessarily like in a trade imbalance and having to like repay debt, which is what they have to do on their side if they're continuing to trade without any free trade agreements. But secondly, we also think that you are more likely to have remittances from people like who are working these jobs who can pay them back to people back home, right? But also, we think if anything, these companies are probably going to set up in like regions that are like poor, like probably not Mexico City, but like poorer regions, because it's just cheaper to build plants in poor areas and employ people in those places. So for their side to say that all of Mexico is just going to be like poor, like rural towns, that's actually their world. They're just trying to project that onto our side of the house, right? So because they really haven't given you a comparative in this debate, we don't think that they're able to win on that argument. The next thing that they say here is that you've wasted this money, right? That like you've invested all of this money, into the thing is, number one, it was the US that invested all of this money. It was US MNCs that built these manufacturing plants in Mexico, right? So if anything, we think that like the US cannot now say, oh, we don't want Mexico anymore if it has already put its money into building these manufacturing plants. It cannot then say, oh, now we want to go somewhere else because there's sunk costs, right? When your factories have been here for so long and have trained the workers in these places, it is a lot more expensive to then leave these countries to go somewhere else. That means that the US has to trade with Mexico. It doesn't have a choice. Whereas on their side of the house, it can always go somewhere else. The second thing I want to say is that a lot of these factories like have already been built, which means that these are MNCs, right? So if they're not going to be like producing cars, they can use a lot of the already existing, like the upfront costs are gone. The factories are built. You can just change the production lines to something else, which is a lot cheaper than their side, which is completely building the factories from scratch. We think that is a lot more capital intensive, something that we don't have because we already have this money going in. We think that even if, like, let's just weigh the short-term benefit, right? Even if like NAFTA was scrapped, just look at the time period, guys. That is like 20 plus years of like free trade coming from Mexico and the US. That is something that has been able to put Mexico among the top 10 or like 15 countries that have GDP. Whereas on their side, they do not have that benefit at all, right? Okay, before I move on, I'll take a few from closing. Nope. Okay.
Why do you specifically need a free trade agreement when you can just make bilateral trade and labor agreements with any other country?
You need a free trade agreement with the US because you want like the guarantee that like there aren't going to be tariffs for this like period of time to be able to like export and import, right? Like what do you mean bilateral agreements? Trilateral agreement, just add another country and like what is your side? Like genuinely, what is your side? Okay, let's talk about politics, right? Okay, so I want to flag that their Trump argument, like they kind of recognized it was silly, which is why Steph got to it at like almost 7 minutes. But like, let's be very clear about Trump, right? Because globalization was inevitable anyways, which means that like people were going to lose their jobs, whether it was to a factory in Mexico or a factory in China. So Trump would have happened anyways. But also there are other reasons that like Trump got elected, like anti-establishment, like the last candidate who like won from the same party was like, I don't know, George H.W. Bush. Like Obama had been in power for like 8 years. Like how is Clinton gonna win? Like again, also like there was a lot of like anti-Clinton hatred. Like, come on, guys, like you guys can't just be like, this was the reason that this happened. But also let's just mock their argument on border security. It's just genuinely laughable, right? The way that they genuinely, okay, so if we believe their border security argument, we would have to believe that like Mexico and the US has no trade happening at all, because that way we can guarantee that nobody's like smuggling in drugs. They still want trade happening, right? So there's still ways to do it, but also a lot of the smuggling happens through boats, as we've seen through Venezuelan boats, right? Not a lot of it happens through Mexico and the border, but also, right? Like border security is like you just put more like agents on the border, like a wall. I don't know. But yeah, so let's talk about politics lastly, right? We have explained to you why we get concessions from the US, which we think is very beneficial. But we also get political change in Mexico, right? Because they say, Steph says, oh, but Mexico can liberalize later and then it can like become a wonderful democracy. Why do we want to wait 50 years for this to happen when we can get like a lot of change now? But we need change to happen now, right? The reason being that if these state-owned enterprises continue to exist on their side, which they can't, because the government's going to prop them up forever and be like, now the state-owned enterprises are exporting. On our side, they're forced to privatize, which means that you don't have the money to like fund all of your like one party rule like regime. But also you can't give as many kickbacks and you can't like suppress opposition by just saying, here's an industry, guys, which means you have less corruption and you are more likely to elect the kind of leaders that we're seeing now, like Claudia Steinbaum and like even the guy who's there before, right? Which we think are a lot better than the one party rule that they entrench on their side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's the rest of this issue. Not enough to be as funny. We would appreciate that very much. And we're happy to come upon to member of government.
Yeah, so I guess I should do this too. Thank you, Soren, for being a great partner. I'd like to apologize in advance to Benha if he is here, for probably things that have been said already and things I might say in the future. Not that they're bad, they might be wrong. Owo wants to say, I'll read Owo wants to say the free market is king, but let's face it, we've had decades of NAFTA. Mexico is still poorer than Japan. Mexico is still poorer than Taiwan. Mexico is still poorer than South Korea. State that development can work. We're going to prove it. We're going to vertically extend on our opening, and we're going to just eliminate OO to that extent. First thing I wanted to talk about is that you don't need full free trade to have some trade. I'm going to analyze this, give you incentive and capacity on both sides. Note that Mexico still has unique goods like, I don't know, agricultural products and things they produce, in addition to cheap labor on both sides. So that there's still a demand in the United States for certain goods that are cheaper to be made in like Mexico. But secondarily, note that like NAFTA took a shit ton of political capital to do in both Canada and the United States. Walking away from the table with nothing is political failure for the leaders that were involved. Brian Mulroney literally had to call a snap election to pass this through the Canadian Senate. I don't think they want to walk away without getting some concessions or some degree of free trade barriers. So we're going to get things that we're not going to directly compete in. So maybe we don't get full free trade, but we're still able to access technologies and stuff like that from the United States. First, what type of subsidies do we achieve? I'm going to prove both incentive for these and capacity for these to be done well, which both refutes our opening opposition, but fills in the gap for our OG, who does not characterize what this industrial policy looks like to begin with. Why? I think we're going to get primarily agricultural subsidies. Why? First, farmers are simply the biggest voting bloc in Mexico. Note that because the new government is like politically liberalizing, they need things like democratic legitimacy, so they're likely to cater to the largest voting bloc. Secondarily, I think at this point, before NAFTA has destroyed the Mexican farmers' economy, things like peasant unions and farmer cooperatives are still strong and are likely to apply pressure to the government. Second, on capacity, note that there's political liberalization on both sides, because let's like I don't know this much about Mexico, but let's think about it. If it is the case that doing NAFTA destroyed the one-party state, then why did the one-party state do NAFTA? I think some degree of liberalization has to come into like do the thing. Otherwise, they would have never agreed to NAFTA to begin with if it was so bad for like the corrupt state they wanted to run, right? But secondarily, I think in this time period, you have other economic trends arising, like the new international economic order pushed by non-aligned parties and the UN. That there's a regrowing interest in things like state-led economic policy to get the non-aligned world out of stuff like this. There's critiques of things like the World Bank, the IMF, and export-led development in this time period, such that you have a wide variety of economists that are interested in this sort of thing and likely to work for the Mexican government to do things like Penn. Lastly, I think in this time, Mexico was the center of the Green Revolution, the place where high-yield wheat varieties were produced, created scientifically, and they have like a mass variety of biologists and plant scientists working on this that allow us to do things like agricultural policy.
On this?
Yeah.
This is probably because there was like more money poured in by the US. Like it's unclear to me why it's the case you get the same things happening if NAFTA doesn't exist. Like,
yeah, so the Green Revolution starts in the 70s and 80s. So this happened before NAFTA and the money coming in. Argument, first thing, NAFTA completely swapped Mexican farmers for the majority of the Mexican population. First, subsidized US corn flowed into Mexico. Mexico was unable to subsidize their agricultural products because things like the WTO and IMF said you weren't allowed to do that, but the US gets to. I don't think we need to prove that we're able to resist it because we fiat that stuff like agricultural subsidies exist, and there's some degree of malleability in terms of the international institutions because of the critiques I've mentioned in the past. This means that the amount of corn that was flowing into the Mexican market was super cheap, which means Mexican farmers are not able to sell their corn because it costs so much more than imported US corn, which means they lose profits in the market. But secondarily, because of standardized IP laws and because of the power asymmetry between the United States and Mexico, the economic partners involved like MNCs, Mexico had to give up things like seeds and other forms of IP at prices that were just not worth it. So Mexican farmers lose the one advantage they had against American farmers, which is the seeds that they had developed in collaboration with plant biologists. What impacts were achieved in status quo? First, Mexican farmers just became disenfranchised and lose their plot. They lose their plots, they lose their profits. A lot of them are unable to sustain themselves in the years after NAFTA.
Point.
Secondarily, there's a lot of dissent that arises. That is like movements like the Zapatista movement in the Southeast arise because there's anger about globalization and about NAFTA, which causes thousands and thousands of deaths that Mexican government has to deal with, which we don't get. And lastly, the losing of your land to multinationals that want to grow like, one seed varieties that get eaten up by plague or whatever, like vulnerable to plague, means that you don't have your land anymore. There's increasing land equality as well, which is bad for the political system. Note that because of these reasons, NAFTA necessitated that we dispossess Mexican farmers because they simply could not prepare for the onslaught of American subsidized agricultural products that flowed into the Mexican market. Why are we able to change? First, we simply get to prepare. If the mutual benefits from free trade are so strong, I think it's likely that we just prepare some Mexican industries to a level where they can compete and we get free trade relatively quickly anyways. Because if it's so good for both sides, there are incentives to get it done when it becomes good, as opposed to when it wasn't good in status quo. Secondarily, we get money to do things like fund Mexican farmers to import things and build factories for things like agricultural inputs, like synthetic fertilizers, allow them to ramp up their production and produce more so that they can compete with low prices of subsidized American farmers. Lastly, we get to subsidize high-tech industries like plant science because, again, this feeds into the ability of Mexican farmers to be able to produce their lands at market prices. I already took one POI. Last thing I'm going to notice is Mexico's comparative advantage and the opportunity. One, because of their climate and the development of other countries with similar climates at the time, they're in a unique opportunity to produce certain crops like avocados or mangoes that they currently export to the United States via MNCs, but in our world would have been owned by Mexican farmers who own these lands to begin with. Secondarily, note that the global population is exploding at this time. There's insane international demand for things like agricultural products. And third, that Mexico is centrally located insofar as they have ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific and are thus able to export to both Europe and Asia, in addition to the Americas as well. Okay, in our world, you don't have things like having to pay for a shit ton of money in UCTs and progressive because you don't have this structurally disenfranchised population that rises out of NAFTA. This is, again, the greatest good, because when you give money to these people, this is the mechanism through which you get development and upskilling because they can finally send their kids to school. They don't face opportunity cost of having their kids work in labor. You get more land equality. You probably get the structural building up of cooperatives, at least the maintaining of cooperatives and power within peasant movement that allows things like anti-neoliberal movements or leftist movements to reclaim power and sovereignty in Mexico earlier. Last thing I'm going to talk about is why power asymmetry with the US is terrible. Note that the US is significantly larger. MNCs will own your ability to change your supply, and US consumers control all of your demand. This means as this entrenches in the long term, you're at the behest of the UN. This is why Scheinbaum folds to Trump's demands on tariffs, because Mexico literally cannot afford to go against US policy. We get the ability from the Mexican government to defy the US on our side.
We thank the member of government very much and are happy to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Quick pleasantries. Thank you to Ollie for debating with me. This has been one of my favorite tournaments this year. Thanks to everyone else debating. I've enjoyed debating with all of you over the course of the tournament, all that. Thank you to Penn for organizing. Thank you for all my friends and for PDD for coming to watch. I really appreciate being here for me. Yeah. Okay. Everyone good? All right. 3, 2, 1. Oh boy, another find about Mexico. This time I read a book, The Extension of Unworkable. No, I'm just. First, we're going to just destroy the gov bench and explain to you why you never do industrial policy well. Secondly, we're going to tell you why pivoting to liberalization is not a given. We're going to tell you why you do it terribly. It says they're going to do it and never actually tell you why you can't liberalize well. We're going to beat it. That just beats their entire case. They don't have fiat. Thirdly, we're going to extend over OO. We're going to explain to you why NAFTA was uniquely powerful, even if the US still trades with you, and why you're able to recover post NAFTA. I don't know why they didn't do that, but don't worry, I will. First extension, why do government policies fail? The first part of the extension is explaining why industrial policies likely fail. What is the the reason for this? Because they do give one. It is that there's corruption and it's like really bad and there's incentives to like give the subsidies to your best friends, etc. I mean, sure, this is probably true in the short term, but it's not a structural endpoint to the argument about industrial policy. Because if there are enough incentives to like, I don't know, build the economy, and there are enough checkbacks to these things, then obviously there's capacity to succeed. We're going to prove that capacity doesn't exist. You can never succeed, even if we give God the best incentives for the Mexican government. 3 reasons why. The first one is informational asymmetry. Like, how do you know which industries are going to do well? There are market shocks that happen all the fucking time. There are other countries that obviously gain comparative advantage at different points in time, and these markets fluctuate relatively quickly. So if it is the case that every time I want to switch what industry I'm empowering under their industrial policy, I have to have a whole bureaucratic meeting where all the government gets together and says, who are we going to benefit and why? Like, obviously the problem that exists here for doing this in the quickest way possible. But secondly, and that means you can probably have like a lag time when it is the case that you have to pass these policies, which puts you at a comparative disadvantage to countries that don't have to do this. But secondly, there's no credible commitment because policies get rolled back all the time because the industry changes. Why does this matter? When parties change, when lobbies push the government to change up which industries they are supporting, when people on the ground are upset that their jobs are being taken away, these policies shift all the time. And the problem is their industrial policies need to be enforced for 10 or 15 years to actually succeed in the first place, to uplift the industry to the point at which they can liberalize to begin with. But there is no credible commitment that their governments will stick to those policies because there's always short-term incentives for governments to cater to their voters instead. So obviously you have no longevity on their side of the house. And no, this lack of stability is the reason that OO asserts that FDI doesn't come in. Because even if the US wants to trade with you, if they don't believe the industry you're working with is going to be powerful in 10 years' time, there's no fucking incentive to take on the risk, but there are other countries that don't do that. But third, there's not enough money to be successfully protectionist. Like, this is the basic silver bullet reason. OGs tells me that you're poor when this started in the 1990s, whatever. Protectionism requires huge amounts of subsidies and government spending to outscale the comparative advantage you're competing against. Where is the money to build the factories? Where is the money to do these things? No one fucking told me on GovBench. The problem then is you don't get nearly the same level of FDI for my stability reasons. The third thing to note is that other countries retaliate against protectionist policies, so even if you do this in the best possible way, all the countries around you that are competing with you, their workers are upset that they're selling less of their things because, hey, you're being protectionist. So they push their governments to tariff you more and sanction you more and not import from you more, which is why protectionism is generally a flawed strategy and especially flawed in this instance, starting from a weaker point. So obviously your policies don't work. None of this is contingent on the short-term like corruption of the Mexican government, and none of it is contingent upon the incentives of the Mexican government. This is a capacity argument that government has never come close to beating. The first part of their policy fails. But guess what? They had a second burden. Why do you liberalize well? There's a whole second part of the motion that neither top half team actually discussed to you. 3 reasons why you can't do this well. And the thing to note, you have to pull the trigger at the right time. There's a certain point at which you must scale and judge. Our industries are now sufficiently powerful and we have to start liberalizing them, and how do we liberalize them? You fail for 3 reasons. First, there's the same info signaling problem as above. The exact same reasons why you can't allocate these policies to begin with are the same exact reasons why you can't correctly decide when to liberalize. But secondly, more importantly, like, you've created really strong lobbies of the industries that you make protectionist. You've given them tons of money, you've allowed them to artificially compete in the market. So there's a very strong manufacturing industry in Mexico that can obviously lobby the government to not roll back the policy and even entrench them because you made them the unique competitive factor within the market itself. So this means if Mexico is somewhat corrupt, if there are some long-term incentives to lobbying because you have to, like, I don't know, have ad advertisements and win elections, etc., then these companies lobby ferociously against actually changing these policies, rolling them back. So even if you know when to roll them back, you can't roll them back. But third, even if by some magical mischance God descends and allows them to roll back these policies, these like liberalization policies get backslid almost instantly. Why? Because even if it is the case that you do this, there will always be one short-term harm to people on the ground when you stop being protectionist. This means people on the ground, for at least maybe a month, or 2 months, a year, have a little less food, a little less money, unemployment jumps a little bit. And the problem is, these are the most proximate things to people on the ground. So opposition parties can weaponize this narrative against you. They can say, the reason this is failing is because this government is trying to do this thing that's absolutely terrible, which means that even if you have a government that's willing to actually commit to these things in their very world, they get voted out of power almost instantly at the point at which these harms happen. But great, what is the CG pushback on insolvency? They say you need political legitimacy. Like, oh boy. First, like, how do these votes outcompete lobbies to begin with? Secondly, why do voters have the financial literacy to realize that, this specific policy is the problem, we probably shouldn't do it? Not just like propaganda or explain this away, like a huge burden on them. Great. Let's weigh this real quick. You waste tons of money. You fail to save the guaranteed benefits that we know NAFTA gave you. I think OO explains this to a reasonable extent. We explain to you why their policies are endemically failing. There is no world in which their side succeeds, and obviously that's a certainty impact. Second extension, NAFTA uniquely enabled Mexican industrial development. First, go for it.
Obviously, the Mexican government has some money. The people are poor, but the government has like a tax base.
So sorry. The burden that you're trying to meet is that you can outcompete huge economies that are pouring all of their money into this and getting the benefit of the US pivoting to them instead, like this is a burden you have not met. Sorry. Great. The OO push is pretty simple. NASA did good things for FDI. But they say, there's like some tariff problems that might happen. We will prove to you why. Even if the US continues trading with Mexico, there is an exact risk that tariffs will be launched at random points in time and you can't develop your industries without NAFTA. First burden, there is a huge incentive for the US to leverage tariffs against you on a whim. Why? And this is the burden that they miss. They tell you tariffs will be bad. They don't tell you why tariffs will come absent NAFTA. First reason, the American public hated offshoring, tons of unemployment rise, which means there's tons of political incentives to start tariffing China and Mexico and not sending jobs there. But secondly, there's a huge narrative about the drug trade and why Mexico is so evil, etc. within the US, which means that conservative blocs within the US push for tariffs to be incumbent because that's a political tool they can use to win elections. Note that you need the stability of not having these tariffs randomly levied against you to build your industries without losing stability, and obviously you only buy that with NAFTA. But secondly, NAFTA IP security and stability were the tipping point to building factories. You needed to import factory machines. You needed to import techniques, and you needed to import tools. And the only reasons that MNCs felt comfortable sending those things to Mexico were because of the NAFTA IP protections that allowed them to do so. So I don't know why you're able to build a factory for the cars in the first place without those car companies feeling safe doing so. NAFTA was that signal. The final thing to prove that, and this will obviously beat OO because we proved the comparative harm that they didn't prove. Final thing to prove, why can Mexico recover from NAFTA even once it's gone away? Right? The first thing that they say is factories can be transitioned. Come on, guys. There exists tons of money in Mexico now because this industry has already been going for a long amount of time. So even if we're starting from scratch, we have more money to do so, comparative benefit. But secondly, cities and settlements have already pivoted to allowing manufacturing to happen around them, which means that you're able to more easily build new factories. But third, it is cheaper to refurbish a factory or change its position than to build it from scratch to begin with. The final thing to note is they say, the US is isolationist. They can't be isolationist forever. They already have supply chains to you. In 3 years when Trump gets unelected, they probably come back to you. I think we put you in a much better place. You have the problem.
Proposition, I have to call upon the government whip. Here.
Yes.
Oh no, Chloe, you have to vacuum the floor.
Nothing.
Nothing's good.
Thanks everyone, and a special thanks to Eamin and Cornell, of course, and thank you everyone for watching. It's the first time I've been in a grand final, so that's cool. Rebuilding the extension. Firstly, agricultural subsidies don't need to be done well. That is, you don't have to spread them equally because first, any farming subsidies are good per Eamin's explanations. Secondly, if they're concentrated in a few forms and this is favoritism, that's great because we get access to economies of scale. You get larger farms that can produce these crops and package them more so that you can ship them better. So I don't know why this is bad. Plus, you get shorter term trade benefits and also you get the returns from taxes, which means you can probably cross-subsidize if the government becomes liberalized and slightly better or less corrupt later, which we think is likely to happen for all the analysis on top app. Secondly, you can get money from tariffs responding to the capacity challenge from MO because you can probably get money just from the fact that you have a good agriculture industry and you can export and you can just get more taxes on our side, but also for Eamin's explanations about why the IMF is ideologically weak and therefore you're likely to get concessions from them when you become a really important part of global agriculture generally. Thirdly, even if you don't buy the capital floor argument for capacity, we've explained other comparative advantages that are completely unique from the amount of money you have. That is, you have extreme advantages in IP. You have extreme advantages in the simple type of crops you can produce that are likely to have very, very strong demand symmetrically. Responding then directly to MO. Firstly, all of their responses are unresponsive because they respond to factories, which is the unproven counterfactual from OG. So we're not bound by it, and our counterfactual is proven, so that's the counterfactual for GovBench. All of their responses don't work here. Secondly, agriculture is resilient to market shocks generally for the reason that Eamin explains, which is that there's extremely high demand for both specialized products but agriculture in general due to population explosions. Secondly, agriculture is politically untouchable. Firstly, as soon as the first subsidies roll in per our counterfactual, the sector grows, which means they become essential to the Mexican economy, which means they become too big to fail. These become the lobbying interest groups that MO is so scared of. Secondly, Secondly, there's too many people represented by these interest groups. There is an extreme threat of revolution. The thing I want to note here is that as time goes on, this threat of revolution becomes even more powerful because the communes get stabilized, because they have more money, because generally farmers just become a more important group in society. Note that farmers don't give a fuck about anything except material conditions. They can't be propagandized. They can't be like not financially literate enough to understand that they want to survive and do well for their families and send their kids to school. The implication is twofold. Firstly, none of the MO's analysis works, our extensions win. Secondly, we're just like proving the extension, whatever. And also like MO's case is like not very explanatory of the reasons why this is bad. Secondly, I want to engage with like this idea of liberalizing poorly. I think the way that we're able to prove that you have comparatively better liberalization against the status quo, where liberalization probably took a long time and was poor, was because we increased the strength of the average worker, which means that you get a more generally representative democracy so that you have more power to take down corrupt officials, which is a clear win on this point for CG. Next, I'm going to explain why both of our extensions are round winning, because I've only talked about the first so far. The first thing I'm going to do is ask the question, what does Mexico care about? Because nobody has asked this in this round. I want to first posit that it's not about necessarily the government, because governments shift from time to administration, and they probably have different interests, which means that impacts matter differently to different governments. Secondly, it's probably the people, because if it's not the government, then it's the people. Thirdly, it's probably farmers, since the vast majority of people are either farmers themselves or reliant on farmers, so at least on magnitude, we're winning just by getting benefits to farmers alone. But the second extension is still winning here on the governmental definition of what Mexico is. Would it, manual guys, you probably should have defined it. Basically, when you have NAFTA, historically and empirically, this is just true. The United States gained a massive power asymmetry over you through cajoling with organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank to do the kinds of selective subsidies, the unfairness that allows them to outcompete Mexico in the first place. We'd say that this is obviously horrible for the Mexican government. If that's your interpretation, then they don't have power. And if they're as corrupt as Ahmed wants you to believe, then of course they love power. And this is another terminal win for CG. Flick from opening.
Our analysis of Mexican credit, interest rates, whether or not you get IMF loans, is the reason why Mexico can sustain these subsidies. Where does the agricultural money come from? If you subsidize agriculture, how do you fund anything else like healthcare, education, and infrastructure?
So I already responded to this. Secondly, your stuff on deficit spending occurs way too late for this to be important. Thirdly, I think we've already explained why the agricultural sector is strong enough such that you get these returns and they're compounding. You have no material to respond to that you're at. Firstly, then, I want to respond to OO. The first thing I want to talk about is why their reasons for it being done badly are really bad. Firstly, corrupt governments also get captured by MNCs on their side. So if the reasons that they say are true for corruption and that corruption is bad in the ways they describe, then their case doesn't do shit. Secondly, political incentives probably still work for the reasons that I described, either electorally or revolutionarily, which means that you probably just get mitigation of corruption on our side. The next thing I want to talk about is their analysis on econ and remittances. The first thing to point out about remittances is that it's probably symmetric because there just empirically was circular labor transfer pre-NAFTA, and I don't think you have to have open borders to necessarily facilitate the movement of workers, especially if it's so beneficial for the parties involved. But secondly, I want to respond to this stuff from the DLO about how Mexican trade isn't cheap because the US shifts to services and needs to offshore. I want to flag here that offshoring is the central link to the entire LO case and OO case in general. I just think that the OG responses are sufficient in pointing out the burdens that are missing in this argument, which are quite obvious, which is that the tariffs are sufficient and that the US doesn't just drop the tariffs such that it does become profitable to trade. So their argument is just unproven, and I think this isn't an interventionist thing to say, and so this response can probably work for CG as well. The final thing that I want to engage with is their sort of Hail Mary defense of political corruption. AMLO, Karthik, ran against corruption. The guy before Scheinbaum, clearly there's corruption on your side too if he was able to capture an entire political regime based on running against corruption. I'm going to respond to OG now. The first thing I want to flag is that they have no proven counterfactual, which means they can't reach certainty on any comparative impacts in this debate. So on that basis alone, we should probably take it over OG. But secondly, I want to engage with the stuff that they, the other stuff that they tell you, which is Trump doesn't get into power. Again, there's enough holes in this argument that I probably don't need to talk about it. And on border security, here's the final terminalization that I'm going to do in the speech, which is I'm going to reach for this really high-hanging fruit about border security and cartels and instability. Just that, the reason that you probably have, and the way better explanation about why you probably have cartels, is economic instability and regional discrepancies in Mexico, such that there are some regions that are so poor that there is no choice except to abandon your farms, abandon your existing industries, and join a life of crime. And the reason why this is particularly damning is because if we are able to explain why farmers just get a better life in the first place, then this removes the structural reason that cartels even existed to begin with. This is obviously important to Mexico because it destabilizes destabilizes the government, it hurts the people, and it kills a lot of people. But furthermore, it hurts Mexico's ability to get trade with places like the US, which probably also proves the stuff on Trump to begin with. The terminalization at the end of our case is this. We've proved to you multiple ways in which farming was incredibly important, why there's a comparative bettering of farming on our side, why there's an empirical destruction of farming on their side, and that's why the Mexican economy gets stunted, and therefore this analysis is winning, because you need an economy to begin with if you even want to liberalize and open, because you need stuff to trade and places to export if you want to trade in the first place.
We thank the government whip very much and are happy to call upon the opposition whip to close off the debate. Hear, hear.
I'm good. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thanks, Rahul, for partnering with me. It's fun. Thanks, VP, for being awesome. Yeah. Just to reiterate, the problem with Muzzi is that it's like magic conjuring with homegrown Mexico companies that don't have any money that we get from anywhere. We don't know why this happens. We don't know how. They don't prove it. That is the problem with their case. That's what they want you to vote on. You can't do it. CG, they know that they are pretty wrong about stuff. I've gotten quite confused trying to listen to them and follow what they are saying, but I will respond to it anyway. How is it that agriculture grows on their side of the house? How is it that this industry becomes stronger? How is it that they develop trade relationships? How do any of these things happen? Here is what I think they say to you. I think they say they'll subsidize it like lots and lots and lots because people really care about agriculture and they are all farmers, so they will vote for us. It does not matter if you vote for subsidies if the money for sufficient subsidization does not exist in the first place. This isn't a problem of political capital, it's a problem of capacity. Like Rahul explains to you, we just don't have the resources to do these things. I don't care if people want it. Then they try to tell you that like Mexico gets some degree of free trade anyway because it lets them develop, but they don't get free trade when it's bad, but they get it when it's good, and so they can export some of their agricultural stuff, but like not all of it, but like some of it, and it's gonna be no, like I don't know. If Mexico still engages in free trade, there are the same incentives to disincentivize farmers. There's like the same cheap corn. All of those things still happen. And if they don't, I'm still quite confused about where the money comes from. The fact of the matter is just like there's a low ceiling on the profit that Mexico can make off of their agricultural industries, even as those agricultural industries get better. So this is not sufficient to provide Mexico with the quality or like the capital that would allow farmers' qualities of life to improve. And you should also care about the like significant number of people who are not farmers and are in no way United States and actually benefit massively when you have things like cheap corn imports that they can now afford. I think the cartel problem, for like the same reason, is probably just magnified on their side of the house because I think this also hinges on proving that somehow they get sufficient capital to develop all of these things. Look, no government team has been able to give you a compelling account of why they have the resources to do this. People be nice and accept that they have some money somewhere, but it's not enough money to develop really strong industries that can compete with other countries. It's not enough money to develop enough like competitive capacity. And it certainly means that they have to pick and choose the types of industries that they're going to invest in and try to develop, which Rahul uniquely explains to you why they will not be able to do this in a good way, why the capacity to do this does not exist. I will get into this now, but first I would like to take my point now if you guys have it. All right, check in later. Okay, first thing is just on why industrial policies fail. I think Rahul proves this to you in a couple of ways. It's not just because of left-wing corruption, which is quite vague and a perceptual argument. It is even if the pivot is probably happening anyway, even if some resources exist, structurally, there's enough fluctuation in how industries are doing both in your own country and in other countries. It's just very hard to monitor when these things occur, what the right industries are to invest in, how this happens, why this happens. It is just hard to make those types of decisions. And we don't understand why Mexican governments necessarily have the capacity to do this, especially in a period of intense political transition. I think that's a big problem because what Rahul then tells you is that policies roll back, they shift all the time because of factionalism. There are reasons why politicians challenge each other about the industries that they want to support. There's backlash on the ground, obviously from people who work in certain things, they work in other things. it is just really hard to pick and choose industries. We don't think they make consistent enough choices to develop those industries over time. We think that even if they do, there is no reason why these would be the right sort of choices. So like the most advantageous areas to develop. And I think that this means that like you aren't able to develop, even if you accept government bench's assertion, which is that there is secret magic money somewhere to do all the things you want to do. We think that it is not clear how you make these choices. There are still structural problems with the government makes, and it is not clear even that money, which we don't think exists, would fix the problem if it did. Yeah.
Your arguments about government policy choosing and spending issues hurt CG more than us. Why does it take so much money to privatize, give tax breaks, and have the private capital go expand?
I'll talk about that in a little bit. I think your big problem is that then you just like can't liberalize, right? Like there's no way to kind of break into this thing. This is the other thing that Rahul proves, right? Is that if what you do is just privatize, if what you do is create tariff and tariff and tariff and tariff, it is really hard to make the shift to liberalization at some point that you guys rely on for like the eventual inflow of capital into these homegrown Mexican industries that apparently exist. What Rahul tells you on this is that protectionist industries, if they somehow do develop, become quite politically powerful. They lobby against change. There's retaliatory sanctioning, which means that countries do not develop trade relationships with you. They have a positive incentive not to do this. They choose other people to entrench as part of their economies. They don't develop trade relationships that you can then rely on for exporting later. It's really, really hard to break into this at the point at which you've made this choice. And it's also just unclear how you pick the moment in which you are going to liberalize when you pull the trigger. We don't know how this happens. We don't know when it happens because we think that politicians often have short-term incentives. They have to accept some loss when they switch to liberalization. Who's going to do it? Why would they do it? It's really hard to understand how this actually works out on-site government. And I think that's a really big problem too. At that point, we think you get rollbacks and backlash to these policies when they exist for the same reason that there is like some loss involved in immediate liberalization. There is backlash on the ground. There are politicians who propose alternatives. The motion does make the government bench prove that these things work at the point at which the government decides to pursue it. And we just don't think that they do that. I think we prove this uniquely over our opening. The second thing is just that without NAFTA, there's an incredible amount of instability. I think this is another thing that we're able to prove. We say that there are political incentives for US tariffs, that if you like wanted to sanction through the government, they want reciprocal tariffs on Mexico's government. They want to create all of those sorts of things. We tell you that like as there's a flip-flop between conservative politicians, they can gain political points by instituting tariffs on Mexico, but there's a higher barrier to leaving NAFTA. So it's just like protects you from the types of economic fluctuations that you might see on their side of the house. This means that we prove over our opening that you don't access much trade at all. You don't get capital inflow. You can't develop infrastructures. And it also just beats closing because like, why does anyone like reform? Why does anyone want to engage with these industries? We're not sure. The last thing is just that in the present, Mexico still has technology that it wouldn't have otherwise. It also has relationships with countries that it wouldn't have otherwise. Even after leaving NAFTA, the United States imports an incredible amount of goods from Mexico, exports an incredible amount of goods from Mexico, is quite responsible for a lot of the capital that they have. We think that's very important. The US is relatively stable. It's a good relationship that they wouldn't have it otherwise. Thanks.